Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at criminal justice from the inside and the outside. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Sharon Richardson, founder and CEO of Just Soul Catering and president of Reentry Rocks, who served 20 years in prison, convicted of arranging the murder of her abusive boyfriend. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Jim Bueermann, president of the Police Foundation and former chief of police in Redlands, California. Jim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Jim, we met at Freedom Fest when you spoke on a panel on criminal justice reform, and I was very taken with your remarks. I asked you on the show to help us put in perspective what appears to be a meltdown in police-community relations occurring in many of our major cities. Tell us a little bit about your background, the Police Foundation, and your role there.
So my background is that I was a police officer in Redlands, California for 33 years and spent the last 12 as the chief of police and the director of housing, recreation, and senior services. After I left there, I went to work for the Department of Justice for a year as a fellow at the National Institute of Justice, which is focused on the science of the justice system, and then took the job as the president of the Police Foundation. The Police Foundation is the country's oldest nonpartisan, non-membership police research organization. It was founded in 1970 by the Ford Foundation, and our mission is to advance policing through innovation in science.
So you must have worked with police departments all around the country.
We do. We have had projects ongoing since 1970 all over the country. We have many of them underway today, whether those are evaluations of policing strategies, or they are things as practical for police officers as critical incident reviews, like the San Bernardino terrorist attack that will be released shortly.
You know, I grew up in New York, and I watched William Bratton-style broken windows policing transform New York City after Rudy Giuliani took over as mayor. His first act was to run the squeegee man out of town, which everybody cheered. Exactly what is broken window policing, and do you think it helped bring New York City back from the crime hole it had become in the 1980s?
Broken windows policing, and that term was first coined by a political scientist named James Q. Wilson and his writing and research partner at the time, George Kelling. In the early 80s, there was a seminal article about this in the Atlantic magazine that posited the notion that if you take care of the small things, then larger crime problems can be avoided. And the way they got about this was this idea or this analogy of a factory that closes down. Nobody's there at the factory and taking care of it. And one day, some kid throws a rock through a window. So there's a broken window. A few days later, a kid sees that nothing's happened with that broken window. Nobody seems to care. So another kid throws another rock through the window, so forth and so on. And pretty soon all the windows get broken. The place gets tagged up with graffiti. And then the surrounding areas begin to have crime problems. So the idea was that if you leave these small problems unattended to, they grow into bigger things.
Well, you've pretty much described New York City in the 80s.
Yeah, and the problem with looking at any one particular strategy that was in play in New York or any other city is that there were so many other things going on. You know, there's a lot of moving parts in a city like New York, and there's a lot of moving parts in a big police department like NYPD. So not only were they looking at dealing with these small, kind of annoying things as a way of dealing with bigger problems, they were also implementing a accountability program called ComStat, which held precinct commanders accountable for what was happening in their areas. So they would use geographic information systems to map crime in the precincts and charge those precinct captains with coming up with strategies that address those crime problems, and held a big monthly meeting where you had to explain to the commissioner and the other high-ranking officials at NYPD what you were doing. And if those dots had not moved out of your precinct, why not? And if you didn't address those problems, then you were going to be held accountable, and that meant transfer or demotion or some kind of discipline. So it was a very focused approach to getting the leadership and the line level officers of the NYPD to do their job in a way that had measurable and timely outcomes. The challenge with a theory like broken windows is that it's never really been adequately evaluated. So while we believe that it was effective, we're not scientifically sure that, in fact, broken windows policing, as I described it, really works.
Current New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio seems intent on repudiating his predecessor's approach to policing, including doing things like repealing laws that make it a crime to urinate in the streets. Rapes, murders, and robberies have gone up on his watch. Is that a coincidence?
We don't know. Certainly, when you stop holding people accountable for bad behaviors, I think it doesn't take scientists. It just takes, a modicum of common sense to tell you that you're probably going to have some problems. Whether those decriminalizing efforts have a causality to increasing crime, we don't know. What causes crime to go up and down is a very difficult answer. And in fact, most social scientists that study this stuff will tell you that it's very difficult to say why, especially at a large scale, why crime goes up and goes down.
So, Jim, you've written and spoken extensively about evidence-based policing. What evidence do you look for?
I think it's important to just explain what that means. We're not talking so much about forensic evidence like fingerprints or blood stains or things like that. Evidence-based policing, that term was coined in 1998 by Larry Sherman, who is a world-renowned criminologist, is the idea that, like medicine, the police would use the best available scientific evidence to drive their policing strategies. In other words, the police would focus on those things that science proves actually works. And that's what we would hope all of our physicians do, that when you are treated by your doctor, you hope that he or she is using the best available science to treat you and not just, well, this is the way we've always done it, and so we'll just keep doing it that way. Unfortunately, most policing strategies in the United States to this day are still driven by local tradition and community and political expectations.
Well, looking at the different policing strategies, what is community policing and how does it differ from the broken windows approach?
Community policing means a lot of different things to a lot of people, and it has kind of an amorphous definition, I think, for a lot of folks. It is not cops smiling or cops on bicycles or walking around. I mean, smiling and being nice to people is just courtesy to each other. It's just how you show dignity and respect. Community-based policing in its truest form is this notion that together with the community, the police co-produce public safety. That the police and the community, however you define that, say, we have crime problems, we're going to work together to do it, and let's come to some conclusions. It doesn't mean that you say to community members, we want you to help us respond to armed robberies, and so we want you, Joe Citizen, to attack the bank robber. It means that when we're talking about things like stop and frisk or broken windows policing, that before you implement those things, you speak with the people that are going to be affected by those strategies and say, here's the problem as we see it. Do you agree with that? If not, how do you define the problem? And here's what we are suggesting we do with it. How do you feel about it? And how can we make this happen in a way that you're okay with?
When it comes to accountability and diffusing potential situations, what role should body cameras play in police work?
I don't think that body cameras are going away. And so whether we like them or we don't like them, I believe they're here to stay, and pretty soon they're going to be as commonplace on an officer as their radio or their handcuffs or their sidearm. We don't know a lot about the unintended consequences of this technology. There are privacy issues at play, but the evidence at this point suggests that the use of body cameras will reduce the number of complaints about the police and will reduce police use of force. And I think on some level this makes sense, just from a common sense standpoint, that whether we're talking about how we behaved as children in a school when the teacher was watching, how we behave when our parents are watching, or if you're in church when the minister's looking at you, people behave better when somebody in an authority position is paying attention to what they're doing. And with the body cameras, if citizens know they're being recorded, they'll behave better. If officers know that their supervisors are going to review the footage, they'll behave better. I think that the technology as we see it today is akin to cell phones from the 1980s, though. I think it's still very clunky. There's a lot of gaps in it, and I would caution anybody from assuming that body cameras are the solution to all of the tension and trust issues between communities and the police today, and they're not going to capture everything. And we have to keep that in mind, that just because there's some footage available, that does not mean that it is a definitive record of what actually happened during the incident.
Jim, race relations in the U.S. appear to be heading backwards. I'm old enough to remember the race riots in the 1960s. It seems that every couple of weeks now, when a black citizen gets shot, we have another meltdown of public order like the one we had in Milwaukee, regardless whether the police shooting was justifiable or not. Is this the new normal?
I think it's going to be for a while that we are going to have these difficult discussions in the future, especially around police use of force. Race and crime, race and policing are difficult topics, I think, for a lot of people to discuss, but they're probably the most important things for us to be talking about. Even if they're uncomfortable, we've got to put them on the table because these issues are not going away. In many ways, I started in policing in the late 70s, and while a lot of people may not agree with this, policing today is so much better than it was when I first started. The police departments of America are much more diverse. They're much more accountable than they ever were before. Cops are smarter. The policies are better, and they're more evidence-based. One of the things that drives the perception, though, that that's not the case is the fact that everybody literally has a smartphone that has video and photographic capability. We have this wonderful tool called the Internet and social media. And when you put those three things together, every person in this country literally can become a reporter. And every time they see an interaction between the police and somebody else that they think might not go well, people pull out their cell phones. We're seeing this more and more. We're now seeing people pulling out cell phones and recording and live streaming interactions with the police. This is going to be the reality for police officers all across America. And so one of the challenges for them is to just accept that and say, that's my reality. I just know that people are watching and I need to behave well and treat people with dignity and respect. Citizens need to understand, though, that what they're seeing is not a definitive record of what is happening. It's always going to be helpful in trying to understand critical incidents, but it's not everything. They typically are turned on after the incident begins, and they don't capture everything.
One of the consequences of all this surveillance and social media throwing fuel on the fire is police are backing off in a lot of places. What is the so-called Ferguson Effect, and do you believe if it's real?
Well, this is something that we're currently studying right now. The generic title for this is called de-policing, and it means that police officers stop being proactive in their work and simply wait until they get a radio call or a call from a citizen for assistance, and then they react to it. I personally have never seen cops refuse to handle a 911 call or when somebody yells for help. I have seen instances where police officers say, and it's usually an internal thing, right, where they are mad at the chief or the sheriff for a disciplinary action, and they say, if I don't have to stop that car or that person walking on the street, I'm not going to do it because last time I did it, I got in trouble for just doing my job. We think there are multiple causes for this, everything from that internal sense of injustice. It's a labor issue internally that most people don't see, all the way up to federal intervention or the prosecution of officers. But we're not sure under what circumstances it exists, and if it does exist, does it make a difference? We don't know at this point whether de-policing makes a difference in crime numbers. There's a belief that it does, but we don't know for a fact. Science has not given us those answers yet.
One of the citizen complaints that led to the explosion at Ferguson was constant harassment by police officers in pursuit of fines for petty crimes. How much impact do revenue targets have on police behavior?
That depends on the state you're talking about in the region. I personally think this is tremendously problematic. When you link police activity to revenue generation, you are on a very slippery slope. If local government wants to increase its revenue stream that it gets from its citizens, that's called a tax, and you need to go to the voters and do this in a transparent manner. When you link justice issues to revenue generation, I think you put into question the legitimacy of the police and you literally start eroding the bedrock of our criminal justice system about being blind and focusing on behavior and not worrying about things downstream. When I was a police chief, I had several conversations in open session with the city council where I warned them that we were not going to engage in any kind of a traffic enforcement or other kind of strategy for revenue generation purposes, that was a prohibition, and we were dead set against it. And the council was very good, and we never did it. But there are some places that clearly have been funding their police operations through traffic tickets and other things, and I just think that's inherently wrong.
Well, on that point, a number of police departments have resorted to massive civil forfeiture campaigns to supplement their budgets. What's the history of that program, and why have so many people turned against it?
Because I think many people view some of the more outlandish examples of it as just being an example of abuse of police power. The rationale for this is that if you can't get to major drug dealers through traditional investigations and put them together with the illegal drugs, then the next best thing to do is to try to remove the profit motive from them and seize their assets. I don't know anybody who objects to the police seizing the assets of a cartel member, right, a cartel leader or something. The problem with this model is that as it diffuses through the system, and you move from the big cartels that nobody is going to be sympathetic toward to cases where police officers may believe that somebody has a bunch of cash on them as a result of an illegal action, and they're wrong. You know, if you can't prove that, our due process concept in this country should apply to these civil forfeiture cases. I don't believe that policing should be funded this way, that local government has an obligation to adequately fund police and sheriff's departments so they don't have to rely on these funds. The reality is, though, in many places in this country, it is the civil asset seizure funds that allow police and sheriff's departments to acquire needed equipment that is not in the general fund budget from the local entity. The problem with that is, like anything, that sometimes it gets abused, and after a while, either the funds are spent inappropriately or they are seizing money from people that have no connection to criminal activity, but the cops just don't believe their story about why they had $25,000 with them. You know, not everybody trusts the banks in this country, or sometimes there's a need to have an amount of cash, and the police should be able to prove a nexus between that cash and illegal activity before you seize it.
Jim, police departments in cities both big and small seem to be acquiring an extraordinary amount of military hardware. What impact has this had on policing and citizen relations?
In some places, it has adversely affected that sense of trust and confidence in the police. We saw in Ferguson where the vocal but peaceful protests that started met by the police with armored vehicles and tactical units. And the optics of that were terrible. And those images went out all across the world on the internet instantly. And it just looked terrible. It looked like a police state. I think in most cities in the United States, the police paid close attention to what was happening there and would not replicate those kinds of things. And we saw, in fact, in subsequent demonstrations in Ferguson that they didn't use that kind of strategies. The equipment, for the most part, that the police have acquired through these surplus military programs in and of itself are not problematic. The equipment is just the equipment. It is how the equipment is used that determines whether citizens in any particular community support the police or are just really infuriated and alarmed by what they're seeing. What we have recommended and what I testified to Congress before was that before a police department or a sheriff's department is allowed to acquire things like armored vehicles, they should have to say to the community in a public way, hold a public hearing, here is what we need, this armored vehicle, for the following reasons. And if they can't justify to the people who pay their salaries that they need that armored vehicle, for instance, then they probably don't need to have it. I think people are generally very reasonable. Sometimes the way to justify this is to say our region needs it. Not so much every city needs an MRAP, which is big things you get from the military, but this region needs at least one or two armored vehicles because there are going to be occasions where we need those to keep the officers safe or to rescue people. But that can come about as a result of a consortium. It also acts as a governor for their use when more people have to sign off on the use of those things. But when the public has the ability to hear the law enforcement rationale for using those and weigh in at a public hearing, then you increase, I think, rather dramatically the sense of legitimacy in acquiring the property and using it. And that's really what community policing should be all about. This is part of that co-production issue I talked about earlier, that not only do we co-produce strategies, but we sometimes need to co-produce decisions about the kind of equipment and the kind of strategies we're going to use to keep ourselves safe.
Looking at the kind of environment you need to make community policing work, what role have the media and activist groups like Black Lives Matter played in exacerbating tensions?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think the media is doing really anything other than just reporting what they understand. Clearly, sometimes people think the media is slanted one way or the other, and I have no doubt that that's probably true. But for the most part, they're just reporting what happens. And I've said to many of my colleagues, I said it to my own department repeatedly, that if we don't want the media to report that we've done something bad, maybe we just shouldn't do something bad. And it's very simple. The Black Lives Matter movement is I think, a different animal. For many people in this country, Black Lives Matter represents today's civil rights movement. It is different than certainly the civil rights movement of the 60s in this country for a variety of reasons. Our country has changed dramatically since then. Technology is different. People consume the news about events differently than they did, and social media plays a very significant role in this. I think in policing, we would be remiss to not listen to what the Black Lives Matter movement voice is. Now, I'm not talking about advocating for harming police officers. I don't have any tolerance for that. And if somebody wants to advocate the harming or the killing of police officers, then they're going to do that without any sympathy for me whatsoever. And I think that there should be some sanctions on that. But talking about what is the perceived injustice or the bias toward people of color by the police is a topic that the police should not be afraid to hear, to listen to, and to talk about. They may or may not agree with those voices, but those are important voices. And in our democracy, everybody's voice should count, just like our vote should count. And the police work for the public. Every police officer in this country takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And that means people have the freedom of speech, and they can say things even about the police when they're not comfortable.
Jim, the 30-year crime statistics in America are actually very encouraging, with crime rates lower across the board. Can we expect this trend to continue, or do recent upturns in crime portend a bleaker future?
I think we're, in the short run, going to see crime tick up a little bit. I'm very optimistic, though, about this country's ability to, over the long run, to control crime. And I'm very optimistic about the quality of policing in this country and the ability of the police to keep us safe. We are at a point in our history where there's tension clearly between the police and communities of color. There are going to be bumps in the road, but policing today is so much better than it used to be. Even with all of the tension that we see and the complaints about policing, it is so much better than it used to be. It will continue to get better. It will continue to become more diverse in its workforce and makeup. And I think it's a great time to be a police chief or a police officer in this country. As difficult as it may be, there is great opportunity to serve the people of this great country and to help co-produce public safety in every community across the United States.
Jim, I commend your effort to elevate the level of discourse. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
That was Jim Bueermann, president of the Police Foundation, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, Sharon Richardson, CEO of Just Soul Catering, who spent 20 years in prison, talks about what made her re-entry into society so successful. Stay tuned.